And welcome, Hoosier fans, to another off-season episode of the Assembly Call. I am your host, Jerod Morris, and I am so excited about the show that we have for you tonight. We're joined by a very special guest, Terry Hutchens, who wrote the book Missing Banners with Tom Brew, which I am holding up right now, which if you've been following my Twitter account over the past couple of weeks, you'll know that I read enthusiastically. It's one of those books that you read and you oscillate between kind of being disappointed and depressed, thinking about some of your favorite teams and your favorite IU players and how they came a little bit short of the glory of hanging a banner, and yet totally enthralled because it's the team you love, the program that you love, and the detail and the depth that Terry and Tom go into in this book is just, it's excellent, and it's a great history lesson for any IU fan. And of course, we all know about the 5 teams that won the banners, but there are 5 more, and actually more beyond that they talk about in this book that were oh so close. And I'm so glad that those teams kind of got their moment in the spotlight with this book. And so we're going to talk about that book tonight. Terry will share some stories from that book, and I highly encourage everybody to check it out. If you go to assemblycall.com/missingbanners, it will redirect you to the Amazon page, and you can pick up the book. And again, I highly recommend it. That's assemblycall.com/missingbanners. And we will bring Terry on here in just a moment. Will is here with me as well. Ryan and Andy were unable to join us tonight, but they should be back for our next episode. But we will begin tonight's episode, as we always do, with our banner moment, and it'll be a quick one. But, of course, this is our time when we think about what has happened recently that suggests that Indiana is on its way to its next banner, hopefully a real banner, a 6th banner, not another entry into the Missing Banners book. But for me, it's really just, now that we know that James Blackman Jr. is back, that Troy Williams is gone, we can look ahead to next season. We know what the roster will be, and as you start to look around and survey what the experts are saying, all of the college basketball pundits out there as they put out their way too early top 25s, you're seeing Indiana right there in the 8 to 12 range. And certainly being ranked as a top 10 team in the preseason is no guarantee of success come the season, but it's much better to be ranked highly than it is to not show up. And those preseason polls, when you look at them at the end of the year, they actually end up being a pretty good predictor of where teams will finish up. Not an absolute predictor, but a good one. And so the fact that Indiana, even with all of the question marks that the Hoosiers have, with needing to replace Yogi Ferrell, needing to replace the savvy and shooting off the bench of guys like Nick Zeisloft and Max Bielfeldt, the fact that so many people who analyze the larger landscape of college basketball feel that the Hoosiers, led by Thomas Bryant, with emerging players like OG Anunoby and a now junior backcourt of Robert Johnson, James Blackman Jr., and others, plus a talented incoming class, the fact that so many people feel like the Hoosiers will be a top 10 caliber team has to make you feel good going into next season, that it has a chance to be another exciting, potentially championship season for the Hoosiers. So for me, that's the banner moment, and just continuing to look forward to next season. But real quick, I do want to mention our sponsor, SeatGeek. We really appreciate continuing to support our show here in the off-season. And I've shared this story before. I shared it on podcast on the Brink, actually, but it was just a couple of weeks ago that Heather and I, my wife, decided to go to a baseball game here in Dallas. We went to see a Rangers game. And what's great about SeatGeek is that when you go to their site, the price that you see when you're browsing the tickets is actually the price you pay, unlike a lot of ticket sites where you go and you see a price stated and then you get to the checkout and it's like $10-12 more per ticket because there's convenience fees and service charges and all this other stuff. When I went, the ticket prices said $45 a pop, and when I went to check out, it was actually $88.30 or some $88 something. It was actually a little bit less than what I had been anticipating, and that's just one of the reasons why I love using SeatGeek myself, why we love recommending them. Because the price that you see is the price that you pay, plus you get the great deal rater, so you know if the ticket that you're looking at is a good deal relative to the price of other tickets around there. So for all those reasons and more, I really highly recommend that you check out SeatGeek. Go to SeatGeek.com or download the free SeatGeek app on either your iPhone or Android and use the promo code ASSEMBLY, ASSEMBLY. That will get you a $20 rebate on your first purchase. We took advantage of that, and the rebate worked perfectly. I always like to check out those promo codes before I give them to you and make sure that they work. This one definitely does. So for any ticket purchase that you have this off season or even into next season, basketball tickets, baseball tickets, concert tickets, whatever it is, check out SeatGeek and use the promo code Assembly, ASSEMBLY. Alrighty, with that said, let's hop into tonight's episode, and I will turn it over to my co-host, Will DeWitt, who will introduce tonight's guest.
Well, I guess without Ryan and Andy, I get to bump up a couple steps here, so that's kind of cool. But I'm excited to introduce a name that you've probably seen on, the Indianapolis Star. You got Scout, and now you can find him on B-Town banners. He's a 5-time Indiana Sports Writer of the Year. I want to say Professor Hutchens, but it's actually Terry Hutchens. And I guess my first question is, now that school's over, because I got to learn from you both from the fall and spring semester, what do I get to call you now? Do I get the privilege of actually calling you Terry, or should we stick with Professor Hutchens?
Well, why don't you just stick with Professor Hutchens? I don't think we should get that close. No. You can call me what you want. I had a student a few semesters ago that started calling me Hutch and calling me T. Hutch. It was a girl in the middle of the class, and I always thought that was kind of weird. But no. Once we're done with class, you can call me whatever you want.
All right.
Within reason. But
I think we'll go with Hutch. My mom goes by Terry, so I think that might get a little confusing at times. So we'll go with Hutch.
That's fine. Hutch is fine.
So, Terry, I want to jump in and let's talk about Missing Banners, which, as I said, such a great book, both for people who are longtime Indiana fans and watched a lot of these teams, but especially for newer Indiana fans. Someone like Will, who's a younger fan, and even names like Calbert Chaney are kind of ancient to them. This is a great way to catch up on the history of IU basketball. How did this book come about? What was the genesis of writing it with Tom?
Well, first of all, I want to say thanks to you guys for having me on. This is great. I follow your work and follow you guys on Twitter, and so to have be able to do this with you guys, I'm enjoying it as well. So that's great. I also like the fact, Jerod, that if you look over your right shoulder, you'll see in the very corner of the shot, you'll see another one of my books, Rising from the Ashes. That's so, right. I got a couple other books that we could add and kind of fill there too. So I'm gonna have to
all right there. Let's put them all right there.
You have Hoosiers through and through. That's the one you need. But anyway,
yeah.
I think Will has it because it was required reading for one of my classes. But
yeah, my grandma actually just read that too. She enjoyed it.
So anyway, but going back to Missing Banners, basically the way that whole book came about, Tom Brew, who another person I have to give a shout out to because Tom, he was kind of the whole idea, the whole, I don't know if the mastermind or whatever behind this. He was the guy who he was the one who approached me. I had written several IU books. I'd worked with Tom at the Indianapolis Star, where he was actually my editor for a long time. And then we got together. He had an idea for a book, wanted to know if I'd like to get involved in it. And I mean, it made a lot of sense because there are a lot of teams out there. I mean, the first big challenge we had was deciding really what the 5 teams were going to be. And I mean, one of the fun things about the book is that, when you look at the cover and you see, and I've got it, so you look at the cover and the 5 banners, when you look closely, you find that they're not the 5 actual years. Instead, we superimpose the years that we wrote about. So you look up on those banners and you see 75 and you see 80 and 93 and you see 2002 and 2013, the 5 years we wrote about. So that was really the big first thing that we needed to do was how we decided on those. And we can talk about that too. But I know that, that's one of the things that I found in talking to a lot of guys for this book was that, one of their biggest disappointments is when they walk into Assembly Hall and they look up in the South End and they see those 5 banners and they don't see their year up there, and they think to themselves, I mean, we were that close, or we should have a banner up there, or whatever the case may be. That's the thing. And so I've had a couple of them tell me, hey, seeing our years actually up there on the banners on your book, I don't know, kind of made them feel good. Although we all know it's not reality, and we all know that. I mean, these are teams that maybe were talented enough to win it, and then for whatever reason just came up a little short.
Yeah. So let's talk about the 5 teams, because the 5 teams that you profile are the 1975 team, of course, the 1980 team, the 1993 team, the 02 team, and the 2013 team. And that doesn't even include the 2 Branch McCracken teams, the 1954 team and 1960 team. And I have to think Bill Murphy took exception to those 2 teams not being in the top 5, because I've talked with him on a number of occasions, and he is adamant about how good those 2 teams are. And we'll talk about those 2 teams too. But I want to kick this off. I mean, I think everybody would agree that the 75 team is the best of that bunch. And a lot of people actually think that's the best IU team of all time, despite the fact that they didn't win the title, just the talent, but of course May's injury in the tournament. If we take that as a given, and feel free to argue if you want to, that's the number 1 team, which of the other 4 do you think is the second best of the teams that didn't win it?
That the whole 92 and 93 teams, both. I mean, we kind of combined the 2 a little bit. Tom wrote about those years. He wrote about 75. He wrote about 80. He wrote about 93. I wrote about 2002 because it was a team I covered. I wrote about 2013, and then I wrote about 54 and 60 as well. But the when I think about it, I think about that 92, 93, and 93 obviously. 17-1 in the Big Ten, rolling along. I don't know, I think they were 11-0 or something like that at the time that Henderson tears his ACL in practice, going up for a high pass and lands on a ball or something like that. It was kind of a freak deal, and so yeah, I mean. There's no doubt that year is another one that was oh so close. But boy, you look at the year before. I mean, I remember that year so well. 92, they get to the Final Four. They play Duke. That was a Ted Valentine game where like 4 of the 5 or all 5 IU starters foul out, and they really the guys on the floor at the end of the game really don't have a chance. They get down by 7 or 8 points. Todd Leary comes off the bench and he hits 3 3-pointers in like a minute and a half, gets them to within 3. They come down and get off one more shot in the final 10 seconds to tie. And I mean, I'm not going to say that I'm not completely over that, because it's been 20 whatever years ago, but I still don't understand why Leary doesn't take that last shot. Who took that last shot?
I don't remember who did take the last shot.
Jamal Meeks.
So well, there weren't many players left, so by process of elimination, we could probably choose it.
Yeah, and they were probably taking Leary away.
Yeah.
But that whole 92-93. I mean, I think that's the one that really stands out. In 2002 was a team that. I mean, they were a 5 seed going into the NCAA tournament. Had a couple of good things happen to them along the way. I remember we were in, I think, where did we go for the first? Oh, we were in Sacramento for the first 2 games. They played Utah the first night. We were able to handle Utah, but then UNC Wilmington knocked off USC in the second game. Everybody thought USC was going to be the team that was going to be so hard for them. They get to Lexington for the Sweet 16. That Duke game, I mean, probably the greatest IU game I've ever seen myself in person. And then it kind of ran out in the Final Four. And then 2013, yeah, you felt like they had all the pieces in place, but at the same time, that team we can talk about the zone all we want with Syracuse, but there's other things that didn't go well that game either. I think Jordan Holes didn't make a three or made one or something, and other guys that had stepped up to that point. It was kind of a perfect storm in a lot of ways for things that could go wrong. 80 was interesting because of Woodson. Woodson hurts his back early on. So does Randy Whitman, but Woodson hurts his back, and then it's a case where he comes back for the final 6 Big Ten games. I think it's one of the most remarkable achievements ever in the Big Ten. He only plays 6 Big Ten games, and he's named the Big Ten MVP based on those 6 games. That's pretty impressive when you think about it. And I mean, that catapulted that team and got that team in the consciousness of a lot of people. One thing I think it's really interesting, though, Jerod, is when you look at all this, okay, so you mentioned 75 as being the best, okay, and that's you can make that argument. But you look at it in 2 years, 75 and 76, okay? I mean, that was a great 2-year, era or whatever. You look at it with 80 and 81, they win it in 81. A lot of people thought they had the team in 80. You look at it in 92 and 93, 2 teams that you felt like had the ability to, that they could have done it. And then the other one that stands out is 53 and 54. You'll talk to most people will tell you that the 54 team was better than the 53 team that won it. They only lost one guy off of that team, and just kind of ran into some bad luck in the regional round. But yeah, so I mean, it's interesting when you look back at IU history, talking about a history lesson and everything. It's just interesting when you look at how many of these 2 back-to-back year teams really had a chance to put up back-to-back banners. We've never seen that, obviously. Yeah. But how close Indiana basketball was to that.
And what's interesting, too, about those early teams, and you talk about the 53, 54 team, the 60 team, it's important to remember that back then not every team made the tournament like they do now, and you had to be the conference champion. And that 1960 team, for example, I believe they didn't make the tournament, right? Because they finished 1 game out in the Big Ten, even though they lost like their first 3 games, then just demolished everybody for 12 straight, but they still finished 1 game out, so didn't make the tournament. And if you think about it, look at I guess the 2002 team would have made it because they were co-Big Ten champions, but, some of these other teams that, had nice runs in the tournament but weren't Big Ten champions, those teams wouldn't have made the tournament under the old rules. And so it does kind of skew it a little bit for some of those older teams.
Oh, you're absolutely right. And 60, like you say, is the best example. And, I think they lost the opener against Northwestern. They lost against Purdue, and they lost against Ohio State. And so, like you said, they're 0-3 in the Big Ten. They win their last 12. I think 11 of them were conference games. So they finished 11-3 in the Big Ten. But that's the year Ohio State goes to the national championship with Bob Knight on the bench and wins it all. And but you're right. I mean, and there's been teams that, you look at in IU history that, maybe aren't the 18-0 that we saw in 75 or the 17-1 that we saw in 93. I mean, they weren't the best of the best. I mean, even 2013, actually, I mean, they're the outright Big Ten champions. But you look at other teams that got in and then were able to do a lot of damage in the tournament. And I mean, there are examples of that. And you mentioned the co-champs in 2002. I think they were 4-way champs, at least 3. And I know Wisconsin was there, Ohio State, somebody else was there too. But anyway, so, but yeah, I mean, you can do the same thing in football. How, when you go back to that 67 Rose Bowl team, and I mean, back then only one team was going, and Indiana went because it had gone the longest without going to the Rose Bowl. Forever, mm-hmm. and so that they get the nod that year. But in the older days, there was a whole bunch of there's a lot of politics that came into play too.
Yeah. So let's zero in a little bit on the 92-93 teams. Those are my two favorite teams, are the teams I grew up with when I was cutting my teeth as an IU fan. Andy Bottoms, our co-host, he actually couldn't be here tonight because he's still so broken up about the 93 team not winning a title. He couldn't bear to be part of this conversation. But I wanted to ask you this about those two teams, because I've always just assumed that the 93 team was better. They went on that 17-1 run. You have senior Calbert Chaney, senior Greg Graham, who I don't think people fully appreciate how good Greg Graham was in the second half of the Big Ten season. I mean, he was phenomenal as a senior. But when you think back to the 92 team, that team made a Final Four, and that team had pretty much all the same pieces, except they had senior Eric Anderson, who is one of the top 50 IU players of all time. And the 93 team, the only major difference is they had freshman Brian Evans, who certainly wasn't, Big Ten Player of the Year Brian Evans he would become as a senior. And I think Anderson, having a guy like Anderson certainly would have helped with some bench depth down low when a guy like Henderson gets hurt in 93. When you look at those two teams, in the 92 team, not quite as good of a Big Ten record, but they make the Final Four. The 93 team, 17-1, but they lose in the Elite Eight. Who do you give the edge to there between those two teams? Which one do you think was better?
I mean, I think you could make an argument either way. I mean, I'm kind of in the camp that the 93 team, and again, just because of how dominant they were in the Big Ten, more than anything else. What I like to look at when I look at both those teams, though, is that we go back to 1989 and what is arguably the greatest recruiting class in Indiana basketball history, where you have, Pat Graham and Greg Graham. Maybe the little known guy in the whole class was Calbert Chaney. If you talk to all the other guys, they're like, he signed and we didn't even know who this guy was. And it wasn't until we started playing in the Hyper in the summer that we realized how good he was. But you have those guys. You have Lawrence Funderburk, who transferred. You have Chris Lawson. Yep. The redhead from Bloomington, who ends up transferring to Vanderbilt as well. You have Chris Reynolds. And then, that was going to be the class by itself. And then at the end, there's one more slot that opens up that allows Todd Leary to be the last member of that group. And the reason that slot opened up, which I always thought was interesting too, was that Jay Edwards decided he was going pro. Or Jay Edwards could have had 2 more years. Or wouldn't have been into that 92-93, but it could have been in that 90-91. But anyway, so Edwards decides to go pro. Leary sneaks in. And, when you think about it, though, those are just some great, great teams. I think that's maybe the biggest injustice in Indiana basketball history is that those guys left without putting up a banner because, those guys had the talent to do it. And you mentioned Greg Graham. Alan Henderson was just a beast and was such a dominant factor on the boards. And Chaney was just lights out. You mentioned Brian Evans coming in, Eric Anderson. Pat Graham was Mr. Basketball in Indiana in 1989 out of Floyd Nods. And, he kind of had an injury-riddled career and had some tough times. But, he was solid, too. They just had so much talent. I can't think of many IU teams that were as talented as that one. And sure, 75 and 76, sure. But that team really had it all.
All right, I'm going to commit some blasphemy here for just a second. I can't believe I'm even going to do this, but I'm going to play devil's advocate real quick with the 93 team because, when you look at what they did early in the season, they were dominant in Big Ten play, but they did lose their 2 big games in the non-conference to Kentucky and Kansas, who were both ranked number 3 at the time. And obviously Henderson gets hurt. They play Kansas again in the Elite Eight, and Kansas beats them by 8. They had beaten them by 6 early on. Is it possible that we overrate the 93 team's chances to hang a banner when they couldn't beat Kansas with Henderson, and then they played them in the tournament without him, that even if they had him, that's not necessarily a game they would have been favored in?
Yeah, you could definitely make that argument. The thing is that I really think, though, that Indiana team at the end of the year was playing a lot better than it had played in those early conference games. I mean, and they had seemed to really kind of come together and gel together. So who's to say? I think Alan Henderson actually did play in that NCAA tournament game too.
He did, yeah. I think he played like 10 minutes. He was just a shell of himself.
Yeah,
he had that big brace.
Right, exactly. But yeah, I mean, and you know, and the devil's advocate point of view, you can make the same point that maybe Kansas is better too. But who knows? I mean, but I just think that team, more than any other, or not more than any other, but more than 92, that team just seemed to have, it was kind of a team of destiny that, I mean, when they didn't win it, you were really, really disappointed, really thinking that was the team that was at that time was going to hang the fifth banner, or the sixth banner.
Yeah, well, and that was, I mean, I think people forget how the spotlight of college basketball was on Bloomington that whole year. You had the cool story where Nick Nolte is following Coach Knight around as he's getting ready for blue chips. You know, the Hoosiers had those epic battles against the Fab Five teams. I mean, has Indiana basketball gotten back to that peak since then, that 93 team? I mean, obviously the 2013 team was preseason number one, but I'm not sure we've ever quite gotten back there since 93. It's almost like when that team lost against Kansas, something left. I can't describe it, but it's just things have felt different since then.
Well, clearly, from that point on for the rest of Coach Knight's career, I mean, I don't think they got out of the first two rounds of the NCAA tournament.
They made the Sweet 16 the next year, and then that was it, with Henderson and Bailey. Yeah, and then that was it.
In 95.
Yeah.
6, 97, 98. You sure? Because I thought it was the last. I thought 4.
I think they made the Sweet 16 and they lost to Boston College with Henderson and Bailey.
Yep.
And then that was it after that, I believe.
Okay. Yeah, I think you're right. So, but then they have a whole bunch of first-round exits, and or I remember, what was it? 98-99 was Orlando beat George Washington or somebody like that in the first game, lose to St. John's in the second game by a lot, and then that was Rutgers last year, and then 2000 was Guyton's last game. Didn't have a great game. Kirk Haston got hurt in that game. Played Pepperdine in Buffalo the day before the Neil Reed thing. It all broke, and that was a bad time too. But and then the following year, Mike Davis's first year, they lose to Kent State in the first game. Get there the second year, have a long run where and then I mean it builds up with the Kelvin Sampson team that, I mean, I don't know if that's a missing banner team, but who knows? I mean, that team.
That team was 17-1. That was a good team.
Yeah, they were. And then the wheels come off of that mess. And no, I don't know. I think you're right though. For whatever reason, I mean, a lot of people want to say that, hey, Indiana basketball hasn't been an elite program since '87, since they won the last championship. But I think it's more like that mid '90s somewhere where, and I'm not saying that they're not an elite program, but I'm talking from a national standpoint, from the way people view the program from the outside. I think that maybe that mid '90s time may have been a little more of the heyday.
Yeah, when those were top 5 teams from the beginning of the season all the way through, which now we're trying to get back to that. Let's talk real quick about the 2013 team. You mentioned them earlier. Obviously, we know all the problems Indiana had with the Syracuse zone, all of that, and obviously Hulls had gotten hurt, had a shoulder injury, and we actually had him on an episode of the Assembly Call recently, and he can't even bear to talk about that game. I mean, it's just right. You can tell how painful it is for him. You kind of alluded to some other things with that team, and I'm just wondering. It feels to me like that team and correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels like they're maybe the most controversial of the five. I mean, they were obviously preseason number one, but only making it to the Sweet 16 and kind of going out as in the way that they did. It's almost like people forget how good that team was because we're so just our perception is so colored by how it ended. How do you view that team and its legacy?
The thing with that team was, again, top six guys. That team was loaded. I mean, had great talent. Had people that could score at every position. I mean, you got Watford and you got Holes, you got Oladipo and Zeller and Farrell and Sheehy. I mean, and I think all six of those guys end up 1,000-point scorers at some point in their IU career. Yeah, 4 of them were 1,000-point scorers that year. But then Yogi later and then Sheehy later. So, I mean, you got 6 really dominant guys. But the problem with that team is that you didn't have great depth behind that. Yeah, Remy Abel made some good contributions that year. I'm not denying that. But then you also, you had, I mean, I think that was the year. Wasn't that the year that Perea and Jerkin came in and missed the first 8 or 9 games, and then?
Yep, that was that year.
Yeah. So, I mean, really, depth-wise across the board, it wasn't, it wasn't even as deep as the team we just saw, lose to Carolina this past year. I mean, I think that team was deeper than this team, than the 13 team. I think this coming year's team has that same potential to be deeper at every position. And, to be a team where you could play 9, 10, 11 guys pretty easily. But I mean, so that's the thing I think of with that 13 team. The other thing is that with that team, yeah, they were dominant. Yeah, they obviously win the outright Big Ten championship at Michigan the last day of the season, at a time when nobody expects them to do it. Thought they had missed their chance on senior night against Ohio State. But they had a couple other hiccups along the way. I think that was the team that lost that debacle at Illinois.
Oh, God.
Where at the end. I don't know if that team lost at Nebraska or not, or if it was the year before, but one of those teams lost. I remember Jordan Holes putting up a shot at the very end that could have won that Nebraska game. But again, so I mean, there were hiccups along the way with that team, and yet, they were still number one in the nation 10 weeks, and preseason number one, and all of that. It's kind of like 2002 in a lot of ways. 2002, coming out of the non-conference season, I mean, that was a team that, I mean, those guys were worried that they were going to be the first team in forever not to make the NCAA tournament at IU. There'd been a long record of that, and they were afraid that they were going to be those guys. I mean, no one wanted to be that team that broke that streak, and that happened a couple of years later. But and then they just, they got it all together and obviously made the great run.
So, when you look at the teams that have hung banners, obviously the 87 team has Steve Alford and Keith Smart. In 81, you've got Isaiah Thomas and a host of other guys. 76, you've got May and Benson and Buckner. You go back to 54, you've got Slick Leonard and Don Schlunt. And you've got these guys that are legends, and they're legends in part because they hung banners. Then you've got other players, guys like Calbert Chaney, a guy like Jared Jeffries, guys like Cody Zeller and Victor Oladipo, who are, outstanding players, incredible talents, but don't quite have that next level stamp of approval of winning a title. And another guy who's like that is Mike Woodson. And I think, as we get further and further from his playing career, he's a guy who, to me, and maybe I'm wrong, that's just my perception, that he starts to get a little bit lost in the shuffle of IU players because his name isn't on one of those banners, and he was kind of sandwiched between the
He
75, 76 teams, and the 80 and the 81 team. But he was such a phenomenal player, and the fact that he didn't hang a banner shouldn't take that away, because who knows, if he had been healthy all year in 80, maybe he does, because it sounded like he ran out of gas in the tournament and that hurt them. But for those of our fans, like Will and like some of our younger fans, and even like me who didn't see Mike Woodson play, what was he like as a player, and how great was he?
He was just so dominant, and that's the thing that stands out about him more than anything else, is that he was just such a dominant presence, a dominant guy, somebody that really could do it all. And I mean, when I think about him, that's what I think about. It's just somebody that, again, was so. Again, he could just do so many things. He was such a great shooter. He was such a power player. And no, I mean, he. But you're right. I mean, so often, I think that what happens is that, when you win when you hang that banner, it validates everything. It validates you as being one of the greatest ever. And you're right. And maybe that's the one thing that that holds him back from that ultimate or that next level designation. So, several years ago, I wrote, I had a blog in the summertime of, what year was that? It had been the summer of 2012. So I have a blog that ranks the top 50 IU players of all time. And it was crazy popular. The summer before, we had about 50,000 page views during the summer. And so, hold on a second here, boys. Got a little something going on here. Let me fix that. Okay. We had blog series. They wanted me to do something different. We do this blog series, get 850,000 page views for the summer. It's crazy, wildly popular. But when you looked at those, the top guys ever, Scott May was there, has a banner. He was on that list. Scott May was 1, Isaiah was 2. He has a banner. Steve Alford was 3. So the top 3 guys all have banners. Calvert makes the top 4 or 5. But then another one is Don Schlunt, who has a banner.
Yep.
Kent Benson's up there. Jimmy Rail was in there somewhere. He doesn't have a banner. So, I mean, but again, maybe 4 of the top 5 guys that you think of all time do have banners. And maybe that's what takes you to that next level, is having that banner.
Yeah.
So circling back to Woodson real quick, can you compare him to anybody playing today?
People ask that. I mean, I've heard that a lot. See, my problem is with Woodson is that, I mean, me watching Woodson is like you watching Woodson. I mean, I can go back and see the old tapes and all of that too. But the reality is, I moved to Indiana in 1986. So, and I was a student at IUPUI for the 86-87 national championship team. That was my first taste of IU basketball. So I can talk a lot about IU basketball from about 87 on. But but really, before that, again, I'm relying on people telling me how good these guys were, and when I did that book Hoosiers Through and Through, and I ranked the top 50 players of all time who are from the state of Indiana, and we did, when you would talk to Randy Whitman about how good Mike Woodson was, I mean, that was a teammate talking about him, and he's the one that that just told me about, just a guy that could take over a game, and that but as far as comparing him to somebody now, that's kind of hard for me to do.
You know, anybody who's listened to this show knows that we were probably the most staunch defenders of the Calvert Chaney legacy that there are, just because he is my favorite player, he's Andy's favorite player. And I'll tell you the thing, and I really, I've always found this with Calvert, but I especially found it reading Missing Banners. And again, if you want to check out the book, it's assemblycall.com/missing banners. That'll take you to the Amazon page. Really highly recommend that you pick up the book. But one of the biggest things I learned was reading the comments of Mike Woodson's teammates about him. And that is one thing where he and Calvert really seem alike in just the unwavering respect that their teammates had for them, from a leadership perspective, from a work ethic perspective, and just from how great their talents were and how good they were as players. And they weren't flashy guys, they weren't look-at-me guys. They were go out, play hard, unbelievably prodigious scorers, but really good all-around players. And that's one thing to me that stood out about both those guys, and especially Woodson, is just how much his teammates respected him. And you read this book, and it makes you ache for him and for his teammates that they didn't win it, because you can almost see that they would, a lot of those players in 81, it feels like they would have given their banner away to give Mike Woodson a banner. That's how much they respected him.
No, I think there's a lot of truth to that. And we hear Tom Crean talk all the time about how when Indiana basketball turned the corner a few years ago, and with the first Sweet 16 team or whatever, and how it kind of coincided with the advent of Cook Hall, and that these guys had their could get into Cook Hall and work as much as they wanted on their game in the off season, and that it was when those guys really committed to that work that the program started to change, and the younger players would see the older players working that hard, and it was contagious. But that's the way it was with Woodson, and that's the way it was with Chaney too. Is that, now it wasn't Cook Hall, but it was the hyper, and those guys were in the hyper all the time, and that's what when you talk to Calvert's teammates and you talk about the respect they had for him, that was it, because he was somebody that who was going to outwork you, and was in the gym all the time, and so those are the kinds of guys that those are the kind of players that really stand out when you look back in the annals of Indiana basketball history. And if you were going to mention two names, Mike Woodson and Calvert Chaney have got to be guys that rise above them all in terms of that. Steve Alford's another one. Scott May is currently is clearly in that group. But when you think about the best of the best, and a lot of them have banners, you think about the work those guys were willing to put in.
I want to talk with you a little bit about the 2002 team, which, again, probably seems like the most unlikely team to end up on this list, given just how that season went and given the turmoil of the previous couple of years. Because, those guys had all come to play for Coach Knight. It was 2 years prior that, of course, he got fired, and you were there for that. I was a student on campus there for that. I still remember the big rally of like 5,000 people, maybe it was even more, on Assembly Hall. And I was one of the people that stood up and gave a speech in support of Coach Knight that day with a bunch of players standing behind me. It was one of the most surreal moments of my college career. And then marching to Showalter Fountain and Knight's speech at Dunn Meadow. It was just unbelievable. And then the following two seasons, it's still. And I think this is what people maybe forget about the 2002 season, is there was still kind of this surreal feeling about IU basketball. Like it somehow didn't quite feel real yet. It was like we were all still living in a dream. And what's interesting about that game, because you mentioned the Duke game, which was such an unbelievable game, such an unbelievable time to be on campus. You mentioned that it was the best IU game that you've seen in person. And I liken it to the 2011 win over Kentucky at home, where the game itself, independent of the context, great game, big game, but when you can, for to truly, I think, appreciate those victories, you had to kind of understand the context and have lived through the previous couple of years to really appreciate what it meant and the catharsis of the win. And that comeback when Indiana's down 13, still with like 15 minutes left in the second half, to come back like that it's tough to describe how much that meant to everybody who loves IU basketball at that time, because I don't know, some people say we still haven't moved on from Coach Knight, but that moment kind of felt like we're kind of turning the page and moving forward. Can you describe what it was like covering that game, being there, and kind of your recollection of how much it meant?
Yeah, I mean that really was kind of the game that seemed to turn everything around. I remember Mike Davis saying before the Duke game, the week before, that, hey, we're going to go out and shock the world. And everybody's like, yeah, right, Mike. I mean, this is the number one team, and they've got all these future NBA guys. And, hey, well, it's been a good run, but, now you're playing Duke. And my favorite memory of that game was, I'm trying to remember if it was on a Thursday night or if it was on a Friday night. Something tells me it was on a Thursday.
It was a Thursday night because I had a pledge meeting for the business fraternity I was in, so I had to miss the first part of it, so I remember.
So Saturday, they're going to play Kent State, which I'll tell you what, I mean, that was the biggest pressure of them all, because now you beat Duke. Everybody thinks you're going to beat Kent State, and, I mean, luckily for Indiana fans, they went out and took care of business, and I think they made 16 threes against Kent State, so that didn't hurt either. But what I remember about that Duke game and it's not so much that game. I mean, it's not so much the rally they make in the last 10 minutes itself. What I remember was 2 days later, we're in Lexington. I've got a family commitment on Saturday morning back in Indy that I have to be back for. And so I get up in Lexington at 4:30 in the morning, and I drive back to be at something, and it was like from 8 in the morning till 10 in the morning or 11, and then I turned right back around and drove back to Lexington for the game that night against Kent State. So I'm driving back, and WNDE, the AM station in Indy, is replaying the Indiana-Duke game for all their listeners. And so I'm listening to it for the first time on the radio, and it's Fish, and so, I mean, that makes it better anyway. But, so I'm listening to it, but the overwhelming feeling I had was, it was the most surreal feeling I've ever had, in that there's 10 minutes to go, and all I'm saying to myself over and over is, how can they possibly win this game? I mean, you knew they were going to win, but at the same time, it was almost a feeling like, you know what, they're not going to win this game, even though, it was just weird. And so, yeah, I mean, that was the great thing about that, was the way they came back, and then how Fife almost screws it up at the end, and poor Jeff Newton on TV, on the TV replay, the announcer said a foul was on Newton, and then they went back and watched the replay and saw it was obviously Fife. But yeah, Fife always told me that if obviously if he had made that free throw and it had gone overtime, or worse than that, if he misses the free throw and Boozer slips in front of Jared Jeffries and gets the offensive rebound and goes back up for the win, and Jeffries hammers him, but they don't call it. And but what Fife said is, somehow they had lost that game, that he would have withdrawn from school the next day. He says they would have been waiting for me at the borders. He says I would have asked the bus to drop me off at the Indiana border. I would have left my jersey on the bus, and I would have never returned to the state of Indiana. And
Man.
You know what? I mean, as funny as that is, or whatever, they're probably, I mean, his reaction coming back would have been one of those. We've seen it with other people. I still remember the day after record transfers, and there was a there was a banner. It was a sheet that was hanging from an apartment complex that said "Burn in Hell, Wrecker."
Oh, jeez.
I mean, you just, the way he did it, waiting for Coach Knight to leave the country, didn't sit well with Indiana people.
Yeah. I feel like we would have been more patient with Dane than with Luke.
You're right. And they were like best friends. They were roommates. But
and what was so interesting about that game too, I mean, look, Jerod Jeffries was remarkable. I think he had 23 points, 15 boards, and Indiana won that game because they dominated on the glass. Because I think Indiana turned it over 20-some times. I mean, it was ugly, but it was also a great example of role players stepping up. Because I think Jerod Odell scored the first 10 points of the second half. He just kept.
Odell's big.
He was huge, and then A.J. Moye. Everybody remembers the block, but I rewatched the game. I don't know, 4 or 5 months ago. And what you realize is they're about in the middle part of the second half. Indiana's offense was kind of stagnating, and Moye got in. He's like, screw this, and he just started going to the basket. And I felt like his aggressiveness kind of got Indiana back into it. And that's, when you look at these Indiana teams, and obviously, we've talked about the stars, but on all of these teams, the teams that won the banners, the teams that didn't quite win the banners, the good Indiana teams had those role players that, that understood their role, that did it without needing a lot of glory. And, I mean, A.J. Moye, certainly you could say he drew attention to himself because of his histrionics on the court and just how emotional he was, but it never seemed like him, trying to be a selfish player. He was just such an emotional guy. But that's what always makes Indiana teams special to me is when, yes, you've got the stars, you've got your Jerod Jeffries, and you've got your Calvert Cheneys, but it's the Matt Novers who set school records for field goal efficiency, and it's, in 2013, guys like Will Sheehy coming off the bench and A.J. Moyes. Those are the guys that are so special and don't always get their due, but when you start digging into what made those teams so great and why they won big games, you can always go back and point to those contributions of players like that as being so important.
Well, in 2002, is that team, is role player central anyway?
Yeah.
And I mean, yeah, Jerod Jeffries is a future pro. Who else? I mean, you have Fife, you have Newton, who has a great career in Japan. Kyle Hornsby was a great shooter, but I mean, that was pretty much the end for Hornsby. You mentioned Odell. And Cove, but I mean, that was a bunch of guys that knew their roles and did them really well. And I've joked about this over the years, and it's not really being fair to a certain player that I'll mention, but so I really thought the biggest moment of that entire season came on the opening tip of the Big Ten opener at Northwestern. And it's when George Leach went up on the opening tip and came down and sprained his ankle on the opening tip. And what that meant was Jerod Odell became a starter, and he started every game from that point on. But Odell, I mean, you mentioned what he does in that Duke game. I mean, he had big game after big game. He really became, he was more than just a glue player. I mean, and again, he's kind of out of that Matt Nover, Brian Sloan, there's a whole bunch of those guys that played big roles in Indiana basketball history.
Somewhat like Colin Hartman for people who are fans
absolutely.
Now. Not exact, but somewhat like that.
No, Hartman to me is almost more remarkable in that, when he was a part of that initial recruiting class, I just thought he was the odd guy out. When I really looked at that class, I really didn't think he was a guy that would really contribute a great deal. I had seen him play a lot in high school at Cathedral, and I thought he was a good player. I just didn't see him as somebody that could be a potential starter in the Big Ten. But he's really obviously proven to be something completely different. But Odell for sure was such an important part of that team. And then just the fact, that was a team that they caught fire at the right time. Have the magical run in the NCAA tournament. get to Atlanta, and nobody expects them to beat Oklahoma.
Killed them.
Remember Donald Perry, another role player, who really came up big in the second half of that game. Perry and Newton both. Newton had a huge game against Oklahoma, and they get to Maryland, and Maryland was pretty good, and Indiana, I think they were ahead. It's either 42-41 or 43-42 with about 8.5 minutes to go. And that's another thing. You talked earlier about how Hulls, can't watch that Syracuse game or whatever. I mean, I talked to one guy after another from 2002 that said that they've watched the replay of that Maryland game a few times, but they always turn it off at that 8:23 mark or whatever. That they just can't watch that last 8 minutes. And and again, that's what made the book. You talked about it right from the start, that it was enjoyable but painful at the same time, and that's true. And it was the same way to write it. It was the same way interviewing all these guys and getting them to talk about their feelings and remembering it, because of the fact that this is something where these guys were so close, and all of them were so close. And all of them, to this day, when they walk into Assembly Hall, I mean, when you walk into Assembly Hall, I don't care who you are, fan, player, opposing player, whatever, the banners are staring at you. I mean, if you don't notice them right away, you notice them pretty quickly. I mean, they're looking at you. Well, they're really looking at these guys that were on teams that really felt like they had the kind of team that could put that banner up there.
Mm-hmm. Now, all right, so you talked about how the players took it hard. Out of all the players you talked to for it, was there any that took it the hardest that when you talked to them that you kind of can feel that emotion from?
AJ Moye, I'll tell you what. I mean, he's still mad. He's mad about things, and I mean, AJ.
How's he doing health-wise? Everything
he's doing
good?
Better. He's doing a lot better. I talked to him. It was about this time last year, and he was out in California, and he was doing some coaching out there, but yeah, I mean the problems he had when he was playing overseas and stuff, it seems like he is recovered from all of that. So I mean, yeah, you're right. That is the big thing. But he's bitter. Bitter about really thinking. I'm bitter about a lot of things. Bitter about not playing for Coach Knight. He came to Indiana to play for Coach Knight, and he really wanted to play for Coach Knight, and obviously he was one of the ones that didn't work out for. Bitter that he had a huge role in Indiana getting to the national championship game, but when you look at the box score, I don't know if they didn't like his matchup, but he didn't play a lot in the national title game, and it wasn't foul trouble. It was, coaching decision for whatever. They didn't like that matchup, and hey, we're 14 years later, and he's still not quite over that last game. But yeah, Moye. Moye was always such a piece of work anyway, and always a speak your mind kind of guy, and one of my favorite guys to quote ever. I remember here was a guy that I quoted one time in a 2-sentence answer it was a small gathering. It was outside Assembly Hall. He used Jeffrey Dahmer, Charles Manson, and Gandhi in a 2-sentence answer, and the question was something like, how do you think this team is going to do this year? It was something like that, and he was, oh my gosh, he was a piece of work. But I love AJ. When I look back at I've covered Indiana basketball for 18 years, and I look back on those 18 years, and there's no doubt that 2002 team is still my favorite team in terms of just people and I mean, even now, I mean, I still talk to a lot of them even now. I talk to Fife quite often. George Leach. George Leach has a food truck in Charlotte, North Carolina. It's a barbecue. And this year, when Indiana played Wake Forest in the season opener in football, George came down and catered the alumni tailgate for that.
Oh, wow.
And so, it was good to see him. And Hornsby's is a doctor at the University of Michigan. He had been at Duke for a while. Odell talked to frequently. He's still in Indiana and doing good things. And Newton had a great year great career in Japan. And so, yeah, I mean, and Cub's back living in Central Indiana too. I see him from time to time.
Jerod Jeffries is fishing somewhere.
Guys. What's that?
Jerod Jeffries is off fishing somewhere.
He's off fishing somewhere. What a great gig.
I know.
And, yeah, really good guys.
It is, well, and it was so great seeing they had their reunion, and tweeted out the pictures of it last year, and it's so neat to see, these teams that you just love and that you watched and you lived with and you died with, to see that it still means something to them too. It's like seeing the 2013 team when everybody was at Jordan Hull's wedding. It's cool that they share that stuff, because I think as fans, you really like seeing that, seeing that it still lasts for them, in their own way, and obviously in a much more visceral way for them than it does for us. But it makes it special to see, and it just makes you love those teams even more, and makes it even more disappointing that they didn't get to take home the banner.
Well, and the other thing is that I think what you'd like to see is how important it all still is to them.
Yeah.
And there was a period there, and I'm not blaming anybody, after Coach Knight left until Coach Crean came. There was a little bit of a disconnect period there where former players didn't feel like they were still connected to the program. And I think we've gotten past that. And I know Coach Crean has had a lot to do with that, and the reunions he's had, and has done a couple of things in French Lick where he's brought all the players from different decades back, and the managers and everybody. But you're absolutely right, because Indiana basketball was such an important part of these guys' lives for 3 and 4 years that I mean, it's something that they still cherish, no matter how many years go by. I mean, when Slick Leonard wrote a book a few years ago, and we did a book signing together, I don't know, last year at some point, and sitting next to him and listening to him tell Indiana basketball stories. I mean, we're talking, almost 70 years ago, or 60 plus years ago, and I mean, those were special times for him, and for a lot of people too, like Bill Murphy.
Yeah. Well, and we didn't get to talk too much about the 54 team tonight, or the 60 team, but again, that's another reason to pick up the book, assemblycall.com/missingbanners. Check that out. There's so much more in there about those teams, and more in there about the teams that we've talked about already in this episode. Terry, I want to be respectful of your time, so one last question here for you. You look at these teams that were so close and that didn't win, and injuries play such a huge role in it, and that it makes it more frustrating when it's injuries, because if your team is at its best and they just lose, okay, it's almost like you can handle that more than, man, the what if of the injuries. You have May's arm in 75 and Woodson, who would come back in 80, but you definitely talk about in the book how it was almost like he ran out of gas in the NCAA tournament. And that team won their first NCAA tournament game, and I believe the second one they lost, that there were only 4 NCAA tournament games back then. So that game would have sent them to the Final Four, but they lost it. But Alan Henderson's, of course, knee in '93, even Coverdale's ankle in 2002, Jordan Hull's shoulder in 2013. And I'm wondering, as you look at this, Indiana with 5 banners and at least 7 that you can look at and say these were close years, Is Indiana unique in that, in having so many years that we look at as being close calls for a blue blood program, or for most programs, if you kind of looked at, kind of just their past, do you think a lot of them could find kind of similar tales of woe, or have we been snake bit a little bit that some of our best teams have dealt with some bad luck?
Yeah, I don't have, I don't have examples at hand to rattle off, but I just think it's kind of a nature of the beast kind of a thing, especially in the last 20 years when you're playing 35 to 40 games, and I mean, a lot of different things can go wrong, and a lot of tweaks and that kind of thing. I think it's more of something where it's not just Indiana. But what you're saying is absolutely right in terms of all of those teams that we've talked about. For the most part, I'm not sure if there's anything in 54 or 60 was just a kind of a.
If we'd made the
bad,
we just needed to get in.
Right, you just need to get in and have a chance in 60. I mean, Branch McCracken said that Branch McCracken coached 2 national championship teams in 40 and 53, but he said 60 was his best team ever. I mean, that's saying a lot.
Well, Walt Bellamy might be the best player to play at IU. I mean, he was a number 1 pick. He was phenomenal.
Right. Well, George McGinnis too, and I mean, we were talking about 2002, and yeah, you mentioned Coverdale's ankle, and that did kind of become the story. I think you heard against Utah. It was a story going into the Sweet 16. It was a story going into Atlanta, and then the thing with Jared Jeffries in a non-conference game in the middle of the Big Ten season against Louisville, he gets hurt. He can't play against Wisconsin. They end up losing at home to Wisconsin, and Jerod Jeffries doesn't play, and they end up in a 4-way co-championship. So, I mean, yeah, there's all those kinds of things, and who knows what Indiana would have done as a higher seed than being a 5 seed, whatever. But injuries are part of it, and no, I don't think Indiana fans should feel any different than other programs.
All right, well, Hutch, it was great having you on for this hour. Sorry I wasn't so talkative. You guys know so much more about these teams than I, and I think I would be doing it an injustice a little bit here. So thank you for your time. I know Jerod enjoyed it. I can just see the smile on his face down there.
That's great.
He gets giddy when we talk about these old Indiana teams. So, again, thank you for your time, and thanks again for a great year at IU. So, again, guys, if you want to get the book Missing Banners, just go to assemblycall.com/Missing Banners. It'll redirect you to the Amazon page. It's going to be worth the read. I'm picking it up right now because just by talking about it for an hour and kind of listening, I'm excited to just read this book and kind of get closer to these teams that weren't able to quite yet reach that banner. So again, my name's Will DeWitt, and I guess for my hosts Jerod, Morris, and Terry, we'll see you guys in 2 weeks with another edition of the Assembly Call. Until then, we'll see you then.